On a freezing winter night, a retired Navy SEAL hears a cry he was never meant to hear. One step closer, and a stranger's life begins to change forever. Inside a dark apartment, fear has been living for a long time. A broken mother, a newborn fighting to survive, and a silence that nearly wins. But sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes He sends someone who chooses not to walk away. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow pressed quietly against an aging apartment complex in Spokane, Washington. Winter sealed the corridors in cold silence, broken only by distant wind and the slow echo of boots climbing concrete stairs. Michael Carter had learned to move without expecting anything from the world. At 45, retirement from the Navy SEALs had not brought rest, only a different kind of vigilance. No patrol routes, no radio chatter, no brothers at his back. But the habit of scanning exits never left him. Neither did the weight that settled behind his eyes when the night stretched too long. Spokane was quieter than the places he'd left behind, but quiet never meant safe. It only meant hidden. Shadow walked beside him, leash loose, pace steady. The dog didn't pull, didn't lag. He never did. Shadow matched Michael's stride the way some men matched breathing, without effort, without question. Michael trusted that more than he trusted most people. Shadow didn't ask why they walked these halls late at night, didn't wonder why Michael picked extra repair jobs in buildings like this. The dog simply knew his job: stay close, watch everything, be ready. Michael reached the third floor and paused. The hallway smelled faintly of damp concrete and old heating vents. A flickering light hummed overhead. He adjusted the strap of the small tool bag on his shoulder, reminding himself this was simple. Check a faulty breaker for a tenant who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. In and out, no complications. That was the lie he told himself. He had told himself similar lies before missions, before doors were kicked in and lives split cleanly into before and after. Civilian life was supposed to be different. It rarely was. He turned back toward the stairwell, already planning the descent, when a sound stopped him. Not loud, not dramatic, a door opening just enough to breathe. Michael's body reacted before his mind caught up. He stopped, one hand instinctively lowering near Shadow's leash. The dog stiffened, ears forward, a low awareness rippling through him. Not aggression, attention. A woman's voice came through the narrow gap. "Please, help me." It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was the sound of someone who had already learned shouting didn't work. Michael turned slowly. The door across the hall stood cracked open, light spilling onto the floor like a thin, fragile line. A woman stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a thin sweater that did nothing against the cold. She held something against her chest, small, unmoving, a baby. For a moment, Michael didn't move. He had faced gunfire without hesitation, but this froze him in a way violence never had, because this wasn't a threat he could neutralize. This was a question. The woman's eyes met his. They were red, hollow, desperate in a way that stripped excuses bare. "My baby," she whispered. "He's not crying anymore?" Michael crossed the hall in 3 steps. Up close, the signs were impossible to miss. Bruises blooming along her wrists, a fading mark near her jaw. The way she held herself, folded inward, as if trying to take up less space in the world. He had seen this posture before, in civilians caught between warring factions, in women who learned too late that survival meant silence. Shadow moved with him, stopping just short of the doorway. The dog's body blocked the entrance without command, not threatening, just present. Michael felt the leash tighten slightly as Shadow leaned forward, reading the room in a language older than words. "May I?" Michael asked, his voice steady. The woman nodded, her arms trembling as she shifted the infant slightly, enough for Michael to see the baby's face. Pale, too still, breathing shallow, if at all. Something cold settled in Michael's chest. "Okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Okay, I need you to stay with me." He guided her gently into the hallway, lowering her onto the floor so she wouldn't collapse. Shadow stayed close, his head level with the woman's knee, eyes flicking between the apartment interior and the baby. Not fear. Focus. Michael checked the infant's airway, his hands moving with practiced calm, while his mind screamed at the stakes. This wasn't a battlefield casualty with medics inbound and protocols drilled into muscle memory. This was a child whose life balanced on seconds. He pulled out his phone and called emergency services, voice clipped, precise, location, condition, infant, suspected trauma. He didn't embellish. He didn't soften the truth. The woman, Emily, she whispered when he asked her name, clutched her own arms as if afraid they might disappear. "I didn't know what to do," she said, the words tumbling over each other. "He was crying, and then he wasn't, and I thought maybe if I waited—" Michael looked at her then, really looked. He didn't see weakness. He saw exhaustion, the kind that comes from being afraid every day and still getting up, the kind that teaches you to calculate danger not by odds, but by consequences. "You did the right thing," he said. He didn't know if that was entirely true, but he knew she needed to hear it. "You asked for help." The door behind them creaked wider. A man's voice filled the hallway sharp with irritation. "What's going on out here?" Shadow reacted instantly. Not a bark, not a lunge, just a shift, placing himself squarely between the woman and the doorway. His presence was enough to change the air. Michael stood. The man was tall, unsteady, eyes darting between Michael, the baby, and the dog. He smelled of alcohol and anger. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "There's no problem," the man said quickly. "My wife's just overreacting. Babies cry. That's what they do." Emily flinched at the word wife. Michael felt something tighten behind his ribs. He had promised himself he wouldn't get involved anymore. Promised that retirement meant choosing his battles, not charging headfirst into every injustice. He had buried too many friends who believed they could save everyone. But as he looked at Emily, at the way her shoulders curved inward, at the way she watched the man without daring to meet his eyes, Michael knew the truth he'd been avoiding. Some battles choose you. "Emergency services are on the way," Michael said calmly. "They'll take it from here." The man's smile vanished. "You had no right," Shadow growled. Low, controlled, final. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The man stopped talking. Michael didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply stood there, unmoving, the way he had stood in doorways halfway across the world when things were about to turn ugly. Inside him, something old stirred. Not violence, responsibility. He didn't know yet how this would end. He didn't know how far this path would go, or what it would cost him. He only knew that turning away now would haunt him longer than any nightmare he already carried. The sirens began to rise in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Emily looked up at him, eyes brimming with fear and fragile hope. "Will they help my baby?" Michael nodded, though certainty was a luxury he didn't have. "They'll try," he said, "and so will I." Shadow remained at her side, silent and steadfast, as if he had already accepted what Michael had not yet fully admitted to himself. This wasn't just a moment. This was the beginning of something Michael Carter had never planned for and could no longer escape. Snow thickened outside the apartment complex as distant sirens cut through Spokane's winter night, turning the hallway into a narrow space where time stretched and every decision began to feel permanent. The sound of the approaching ambulance should have brought relief, yet Michael Carter felt none. Instead, a familiar tension settled into his chest, the kind that used to come right before something went wrong. He stayed where he was, positioned between Emily and the man behind her, aware of Shadow's quiet presence anchoring the space. The dog's focus was absolute, not driven by anger, but by a deep, learned understanding that danger did not always announce itself loudly. Michael recognized that instinct because it mirrored his own. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were the quiet ones, when people convinced themselves nothing truly bad would happen. Emily sat on the floor, arms wrapped around herself now that the baby had been taken from her hands by the paramedics who had arrived moments earlier, her breathing uneven, as if she were afraid to inhale too deeply and collapse entirely. Michael watched her from the corner of his vision, fighting the urge to offer comfort he wasn't sure he had the right to give. He had been trained to secure situations, not people's hearts, and yet here he was, standing guard in a place that felt far more fragile than any hostile territory he'd crossed overseas. The man began pacing, muttering explanations that sounded less like defense and more like rehearsal, each sentence delivered as though it might be graded by an unseen audience. Michael listened without engaging, his thoughts drifting to a memory he rarely allowed himself to touch. A night years earlier, when a civilian village had gone silent after an explosion, the cries stopping too suddenly, too completely. He remembered standing in the aftermath, realizing that silence could be louder than screams. That memory tightened his jaw now, as he watched Emily flinch every time the man spoke, her body reacting before her mind could reason through the words. Shadow shifted slightly, not to threaten, but to remind the man that he was being watched, and Michael felt an odd gratitude for the animal's clarity. Dogs did not rationalize cruelty. They recognized it and responded accordingly. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices professional and calm, asking short questions that Emily struggled to answer, not because she didn't know, but because fear had tangled her thoughts into knots. Michael answered when he could, offering factual details without speculation, grounding himself in procedure the way he always had. It helped him stay steady, helped him avoid thinking too deeply about the fact that this was no longer a moment he could walk away from. When one of the paramedics asked about injuries, the man interjected too quickly, insisting it was nothing, that babies were fragile, that people overreacted, and Michael felt a flicker of anger he had learned to keep buried. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, controlled kind that sharpened his focus. He met the man's eyes and said nothing, allowing the silence to do the work instead. The man looked away first. Police arrived shortly after, their presence shifting the atmosphere again, introducing a different kind of authority that Emily seemed unsure whether to trust. Michael noticed her hesitation, the way her hands clenched in her sleeves, and he understood it more than he wished he did. Trust was not something trauma allowed easily. An officer asked questions, simple ones at first, and Emily's voice trembled as she answered, her words careful, as if she were navigating a field of hidden traps. Michael stood nearby, not speaking, unless asked, aware that too much involvement too soon could complicate things for her later. This was her story to tell, not his, and he respected that boundary even as every instinct urged him to shield her from the process entirely. Shadow sat at his side, calm and unmoving, a quiet presence that seemed to give Emily something solid to focus on when her gaze drifted. Michael wondered briefly what Shadow sensed in her, whether the dog recognized the same exhaustion and fear he did, the same determination struggling to surface beneath it. When the officers spoke to the man, their tone shifted, growing firmer as contradictions appeared, and Michael felt the weight of inevitability settle in. He had seen this pattern before, not just in war zones, but in quieter places too, where harm hid behind closed doors until someone finally refused to look away. As Emily was told she would need to come to the hospital, she looked at Michael with an expression that startled him, not pleading exactly but searching, as if she were trying to understand what role he would play now that the moment of crisis was passing. He realized then that she was not just afraid of what might happen to her child, but of what might happen after, when the noise faded and the systems took over. He offered no promises, only a steady nod, a wordless acknowledgement that he would not disappear the second the sirens did. That decision, once made, settled heavily inside him. He knew the cost of staying, even without knowing its shape yet. As Emily was guided toward the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, Michael felt Shadow's attention sharpen again, the dog sensing transition, uncertainty, the possibility of separation. Michael rested a hand briefly on the leash, grounding himself in the familiar pressure, and watched as the vehicle doors closed. The man was being spoken to by police now, his voice raised, his certainty unraveling, and Michael felt no satisfaction in it, only a sober awareness that this was the beginning of a longer process, not an ending. As the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing against the snow, Michael stood in the empty hallway, the silence returning in a different form, heavier now with consequence. He realized he was standing at a crossroads he had avoided for years, one that did not involve orders or missions, but choice. He turned toward the stairwell with Shadow beside him, not yet following, not yet leaving, and wondered how many times in his life he had mistaken walking away for survival. The question lingered, unanswered, as he made his way down toward the cold night, knowing the next step would require more than instinct alone. Dawn crept over Spokane in muted gray tones, winter light reflecting off snowbanks outside the hospital as the city slowly woke, unaware that lives inside its walls were balancing between fracture and survival. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet urgency, a place where time stretched differently, measured not in hours but in heartbeats and monitor beeps. Michael Carter stood near the edge of the waiting area, hands loosely clasped, posture relaxed in a way that only came from long training, yet inside him nothing was settled. Shadow lay at his feet, not sleeping, simply present, aware that this space mattered. Michael had followed the ambulance without hesitation, not because anyone had asked him to, but because leaving had felt wrong in a way he could not rationalize away. He told himself he was here only to make sure Emily and her child were safe until the system took over, but the lie felt thin even as he formed it. He watched Emily sit hunched forward in a plastic chair, wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes fixed on nothing. The baby had been taken beyond the double doors almost immediately, swallowed by bright lights and practiced hands, and the absence seemed to hollow her out. Michael recognized that look. He had seen it in soldiers waiting on medevac reports, in families standing outside operating rooms overseas, in himself when he learned that some outcomes were no longer under his control. Control had been his currency for most of his life, earned through discipline and sacrifice, and now it was useless. A nurse came and went, offering small, carefully worded updates that sounded hopeful without promising anything. And Michael noticed how Emily flinched at each phrase, as if hope itself had become something dangerous. He wanted to tell her to breathe, to sit back, to rest. But he knew better than to issue commands where none were needed. She had lived under commands long enough. Shadow shifted slightly when voices rose down the corridor, the dog's attention sharpening as police officers approached. Michael felt his body respond automatically, awareness narrowing, but he forced himself to remain still. This was not his terrain, not his authority. The officers spoke quietly, professional but firm, and Michael listened as Emily answered questions in a voice that wavered but did not break. He felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow watching her speak. Pride because she was doing it at all, sorrow because it should never have required this much courage. When the officers asked about the child's injuries, Emily hesitated, glancing instinctively toward the hallway as if expecting her husband to appear and correct her. That moment told Michael more than any words could have. Trauma trained people to look for permission, even when none was owed. He caught Shadow's eyes then, the dog's gaze steady and intent, and wondered if Shadow sensed the same thing he did. that the real danger was not over just because they were inside a hospital. The man arrived shortly after, escorted by police, his voice loud with protest, his certainty unraveling. Michael did not look at him directly. He had learned that sometimes denying someone attention was more effective than confrontation. He focused instead on Emily, on the way her shoulders tightened as the man spoke, on the way her hands clenched in the blanket. Without thinking, Michael shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between her and the source of her fear, not as a threat, but as a barrier. Shadow mirrored the movement, calm and deliberate. The officers noticed. They said nothing, but their posture changed, attention recalibrating. Michael felt the weight of an old responsibility settle back onto him, familiar and unwelcome, like armor he had hoped to set down for good. He reminded himself that this was not a mission, that he was not in charge, but the distinction blurred in moments like this. When the officers led the man away to continue questioning, Emily's breath left her in a rush she hadn't realized she was holding. She did not cry. She simply sat there, empty, as if the adrenaline that had carried her through the night had finally run out. Michael took a seat across from her, careful not to crowd her space. He said nothing at first, allowing silence to exist without pressure. Silence, he knew, could be safe too, depending on who controlled it. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time slipped in and out of focus. He found himself thinking about a teammate from years ago, a man who had survived combat only to be undone by the quiet that followed, by the lack of structure and purpose. Michael had promised himself he would not end the same way, hollowed out by peace he didn't know how to live inside. Yet here he was, drawn once again into a situation defined by risk and responsibility, feeling more alive in this fragile uncertainty than he ever did in the safety of his empty home. A doctor eventually approached, expression carefully neutral, and Michael stood instinctively, then stopped himself, letting Emily rise first. The update was cautious, but not hopeless. The baby was alive, critical, but alive. The words landed with visible force, bending Emily forward as tears finally came, silent and shaking. Michael felt something tighten in his throat, an emotion he didn't name. He rested one hand on Shadow's leash, grounding himself as the dog leaned subtly closer, offering steady presence without demand. In that moment, Michael understood that this was no longer about witnessing or intervening. It was about staying through the uncertainty, through the systems and questions and consequences that would follow. As the doctor walked away, Emily looked at Michael with a question she didn't voice, a question about whether he would vanish now that the immediate crisis had passed. Michael met her gaze and answered without words, holding it steady until she nodded, a small acknowledgement that felt heavier than any promise. Somewhere in the hospital, alarms beeped, carts rolled, life continued with indifferent momentum. Michael knew that by choosing not to leave, he had stepped fully into something he could not control or abandon. The path ahead was unclear, layered with legal shadows and emotional terrain he was untrained to navigate. But as he stood there with Shadow at his side, he felt certain of one thing. Whatever came next, he would not look away. Night returned to Spokane wrapped in falling snow, the hospital windows reflecting pale lights as winter pressed closer, sealing the building into a quiet island where waiting became its own kind of endurance. By the time darkness settled fully outside the hospital, Michael Carter felt the slow, familiar fatigue that came not from lack of sleep, but from sustained vigilance. It was the exhaustion of staying alert when nothing was actively happening, the kind that used to fill long hours on overwatch when the world seemed calm, but never truly was. Emily sat a few chairs away now, her posture slightly less collapsed than before, though the tension had not left her body. The baby remained in intensive care, unseen, existing only through updates delivered in careful phrases that balanced honesty with restraint. Michael listened to those updates with the same discipline he once reserved for mission briefings, cataloging information while knowing that none of it could give him control. Control was an illusion here, and acknowledging that unsettled him more than he expected. Shadow lay near Emily's feet, not touching her, not demanding attention, simply choosing proximity. Michael noticed that when Emily's breathing began to quicken, the dog's focus sharpened, his awareness tracking her distress as if it were a sound only he could hear. Michael wondered how many nights Shadow had spent sensing fear before it was spoken, how often loyalty meant remaining still instead of acting. A social worker arrived quietly, introducing herself with practiced calm and an apologetic tone that suggested she already knew she was stepping into something fragile. She spoke to Emily first, explaining procedures, next steps, options that sounded orderly on the surface but carried heavy implications beneath them. Michael watched Emily's face tighten again, the word placement echoing unspoken fears about separation, about systems that might decide she was unfit simply because she had survived something violent. Michael felt a familiar resistance rise inside him, an instinctive rejection of processes that reduced human suffering to checklists. He reminded himself that anger here would help no one. The social worker eventually turned her attention toward him, asking who he was, why he was present, what his relationship to Emily might be. The questions were neutral, but Michael heard the unasked ones beneath them. Was he safe? Was he temporary? Would he disappear? He answered simply, truthfully, where he could, aware that too much detail would complicate things. He did not claim authority. He did not claim ownership. He only stated that he had been there when help was needed, and that he intended to remain until Emily no longer stood alone. That answer surprised him with its own certainty. Emily looked at him then, not with gratitude exactly, but with something closer to disbelief, as if she were testing whether the ground beneath her might finally hold. The social worker nodded, making notes, explaining that decisions would be made later, that nothing final would happen tonight. The phrase should have been reassuring, yet Michael saw how it only postponed Emily's fear instead of easing it. Waiting, he knew, could be worse than bad news. After the social worker left, the hospital seemed quieter, though the constant low hum of machines never stopped. Michael sat back, letting silence exist without trying to fill it, aware that presence itself could be a form of support. He found his thoughts drifting again, this time to his own years, after leaving the military, to the way structure vanished overnight, leaving him alone with memories he had no framework to carry. He had learned to live narrowly, to avoid attachments that might ask more of him than he could give. Yet here he was, already entangled, already choosing involvement over distance. Shadow shifted closer to Emily, and when she finally rested a hand briefly on the dog's back, Michael felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. Trust, he realized, was not built through declarations, but through consistency, through staying when leaving would be easier. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. A doctor delivered another update, cautious but marginally improved, and Emily closed her eyes as if absorbing the information physically. Michael remained where he was, anchoring himself in routine observation, noting details he did not need but could not stop tracking. At some point, the hospital lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of late night. Michael understood then that this was not a situation measured in minutes anymore. It would stretch into days, into decisions with consequences he could not yet see. Emily finally spoke, her voice low, almost embarrassed. She asked what would happen to her if the baby survived, if the man was charged, if she would be allowed to keep her child. Michael did not offer false certainty. He told her what he knew and admitted what he did not. He told her she would not face those questions alone. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that unsettled and grounded him simultaneously. As the night deepened, Emily dozed in brief, restless intervals, exhaustion pulling her under, and fear snapping her back awake. Michael stayed alert, shadow mirroring his wakefulness, the dog's loyalty extending beyond command into choice. Michael realized then that this night marked a shift not just for Emily, but for himself as well. He had crossed from witness to participant, from responder to protector, and there was no clean line back. As snow continued to fall outside, softening the city into something almost peaceful, Michael understood that the hardest part was not the confrontation already past, but the responsibility still forming ahead. He did not know exactly what Chapter 4 of this unfolding story would demand of him next, but he knew one thing with clarity he had not felt in years. He would stay through the night. Morning light filtered weakly through hospital windows, turning the snow outside into a dull gray field as Spokane resumed its routines, unaware that inside these walls decisions were forming that would reshape more than one life. By the time the day shift fully took over, Michael Carter felt the quiet pressure of being evaluated without standing in front of anyone. He recognized the sensation immediately. It was the same invisible scrutiny he had felt during debriefings long ago when every action was replayed, weighed and judged by people who had not been there. He sat across from Emily in the waiting area, coffee untouched in his hands, listening as the hospital slowly filled with new voices, carts, and footsteps. The baby remained in intensive care, status unchanged, and that uncertainty lingered like a held breath neither of them dared release. When a woman approached and introduced herself as a representative from Child Protective Services, Michael felt something tighten inside him. Not fear exactly, but resolve. He reminded himself that this was not an enemy presence, not an interrogation meant to break him, yet his posture adjusted instinctively, shoulders squaring, attention sharpening. The CPS worker spoke calmly, explaining that her role was to assess safety and temporary arrangements while the investigation continued. Michael noticed the way Emily's hands clenched at the word temporary, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unstable again. Questions followed, directed first at Emily, then at him, careful and methodical, circling around living situations, support systems, past incidents. Michael answered honestly but selectively, understanding that precision mattered more than emotion here. He spoke of finding Emily in distress, of calling emergency services, of staying because leaving would have felt wrong. He did not speak of combat or medals or the things people tended to romanticize once they heard the words Navy SEAL. Those details were irrelevant to what mattered now. What mattered was consistency, presence, and intent. Shadow remained close, not intruding, simply existing as proof of steadiness. Michael noticed how the CPS worker's attention flicked briefly toward the dog and then back to Emily, perhaps recognizing that calm could be contagious. Emily answered questions haltingly at first, then with more strength as the conversation continued, as if saying things out loud in a neutral space made them real in a way silence never had. Michael felt a strange mix of admiration and sorrow watching her find that voice. He had learned to speak under pressure early in life. She was learning now under far heavier stakes. When the CPS worker explained that temporary arrangements would need to be made depending on the baby's condition and the outcome of the investigation, Michael sensed the moment Emily's fear shifted from immediate danger to long-term uncertainty. That fear was quieter, more corrosive. He leaned forward slightly, careful not to interrupt, and said only that he was willing to provide support however needed in the interim. The words felt heavier once spoken, less abstract. He wondered briefly when exactly the line between assistance and responsibility had been crossed. The CPS worker acknowledged his statement without committing to anything, explaining that further evaluation would be required. Michael accepted that answer with a nod, though impatience stirred beneath the surface. He reminded himself that systems moved at their own pace, indifferent to urgency. After she left, Emily sat very still, eyes unfocused, as if bracing for something else to fall apart. Michael did not rush to fill the space. He had learned that some moments demanded quiet rather than reassurance. Shadow shifted slightly, sensing Emily's tension, and when she reached out absent-mindedly to rest her hand against the dog, Michael felt a small but undeniable easing in the room. That simple contact carried a kind of permission neither of them had spoken aloud. Hours passed. A doctor updated them again, cautious optimism replacing earlier restraint, and Michael saw how Emily clung to that phrasing, repeating it under her breath like a protective charm. As the day wore on, Michael found himself thinking less about leaving and more about logistics, about where Emily would go if discharged, about how systems intersected and failed. The thoughts unsettled him because they sounded like planning, not observation. He had avoided planning for others since leaving the service, wary of the expectations it created. Yet here, planning felt unavoidable. When Emily finally asked him what would happen next, the question carried no accusation, only fatigue. Michael answered carefully, outlining possibilities without pretending certainty. He told her that processes would continue, that there would be decisions neither of them could rush, but that she would not face them alone. Saying it again reinforced something inside him, a quiet commitment, forming not out of heroism, but necessity. As afternoon edged toward evening, Michael understood that Chapter 5 of this unfolding story was not defined by action, but by evaluation, by being measured and choosing to remain present anyway. He knew the next phase would demand more clarity, more sacrifice, and that the systems now involved would not easily step aside. But as he sat there with Emily and Shadow, listening to the steady rhythms of a hospital doing its work, he accepted a truth that no longer frightened him. This was not a temporary pause, it was preparation. Late afternoon settled over Spokane as pale winter light slanted through hospital glass. The snow outside, untouched and quiet, while inside the ICU time narrowed to measured breaths and guarded hope. Michael Carter learned quickly that hope was heavier than despair. Despair had edges you could brace against. Hope demanded balance. He stood near the ICU doors, hands loosely folded, feeling the peculiar weight of waiting for news that could not be rushed without consequence. Shadow lay at his side, not asleep, simply attuned, sensing the cadence of the place and the strain inside the people moving through it. Michael had known many forms of readiness in his life, but this one was different. There was no checklist to complete, no objective to secure. There was only presence, and the discipline to hold it without demanding answers. When the doctor finally emerged, the look on his face was cautious rather than grim, and Michael felt his chest tighten, as if bracing for impact. The words came carefully, precise and restrained. The baby had stabilized, not out of danger, but no longer slipping. Michael watched Emily receive the news as if it were physical force. Her knees softened, her breath broke, tears came without sound. He did not touch her. He understood that this relief belonged to her alone, that his role was to make space for it, not claim it. Shadow shifted closer, a subtle movement, offering the quiet steadiness that had become his language. Michael felt an unexpected pressure behind his eyes and turned slightly away, grounding himself in the familiar act of counting breaths. Stabilized did not mean safe. He knew that too well. It meant time, and time changed everything. The doctor explained the next steps, the hours of monitoring ahead, the possibilities that could unfold in either direction. Michael listened, absorbing information without reacting, the way he had been trained, yet something inside him was changing. He was no longer listening as a responder waiting to disengage. He was listening as someone whose future had quietly begun to align with outcomes beyond his control. As Emily was allowed a brief visit, Michael remained outside, watching through glass as she stood beside the incubator, her hands hovering, afraid to touch too much, afraid to do anything wrong. He recognized that fear intimately, the fear of causing harm simply by existing. It angered him in a way he did not let surface. He looked down at Shadow, whose attention never wavered, and wondered how much of protection was restraint rather than action. Hours passed in fragments. Nurses came and went. Forms appeared, disappeared, reappeared, with new signatures required. Michael answered questions when asked, his words careful, his tone steady. He noticed that staff began to look at him differently, less as a bystander and more as a constant. That recognition unsettled him. Permanence had never been his goal. Yet here it was, forming regardless. Emily returned from the ICU visibly changed, exhaustion layered with something like resolve. She spoke quietly, asking questions that were no longer only about survival, but about what came after: housing, safety, distance. Michael felt the shift immediately. These were not hypothetical questions. They were plans in formation. He told her what he knew, admitted what he did not, and listened when she spoke of fears that extended beyond the hospital walls. He did not interrupt when she blamed herself. He did not correct her when she spoke as if pain were a personal failure. He had learned that people reached truth in their own time and that forcing it only caused harm. Shadow rested his head near her knee, and when she noticed, a faint, surprised smile crossed her face before disappearing again. Michael saw it anyway. It mattered. As evening approached, a nurse mentioned that arrangements would need to be discussed soon, that Emily would not be able to return to her apartment under current conditions. The words were gentle, but the implication was sharp. Michael felt the familiar tightening again, the internal calculation beginning without permission: space, distance, protection. He thought of his own small house on the outskirts of town, empty and orderly, built to accommodate solitude, not family. The thought unsettled him, not because it felt impossible, but because it felt dangerously plausible. He did not voice it, not yet. Decisions made too quickly often carried unintended costs. When Emily asked if he thought the baby would recover fully, Michael answered honestly. He said there were no guarantees, but there was time now, and time was not nothing. She nodded, accepting that answer in a way that told him she had learned to live without guarantees long ago. Shadow rose when voices approached again, the dog's attention sharpening, and Michael saw another official moving toward them, carrying a folder, posture careful. There would be more questions, more assessments, more moments where patience would be tested. Michael felt the edges of fatigue pressing in, the kind that made impulsive decisions tempting, and he resisted it deliberately. He had survived worse by not rushing. As night began to reclaim the windows, Emily rested briefly, head tilted back, eyes closed but not sleeping. Michael remained awake, watching the hallway, aware that he had crossed into a space where staying was no longer provisional. He thought of the man he had been before this winter night, the one who believed withdrawal was a form of survival. That belief felt thinner now, stretched by reality. When Emily woke and looked at him, her expression carried a question she still did not ask. Michael met her gaze and felt the quiet certainty settle deeper. Whatever arrangements came next, whatever systems demanded, he would not vanish between steps. Shadow seemed to sense it too, his posture easing slightly, as if acknowledging a commitment had been made. The ICU doors remained closed, the baby unseen, yet no longer slipping away. As Michael watched the snow continue to fall outside, untouched and relentless, he understood that stabilization was not an end. It was an opening. And openings, he knew, demanded courage of a different kind. Snow lay undisturbed across Spokane as evening settled into stillness, the hospital lights fading behind them while winter pressed close, not as a threat now, but as a quiet witness to what had already changed. Michael Carter felt the shift the moment the hospital doors closed behind them, a subtle release of tension that did not bring relief so much as responsibility. The baby remained inside, monitored and guarded by systems Michael had learned to respect, but Emily walked beside him now without the collapse that had marked her steps before, exhaustion present, yet no longer dominant. Shadow moved in silence, attentive but calm, sensing that the perimeter had changed from crisis to continuity, from immediate danger to something that required steadiness rather than force. Michael drove through streets softened by snow and sodium light, aware that this drive mattered more than any he had taken in years because it was not about escape or return, but transition. He thought about the man he had been trained to be, someone who completed missions and withdrew cleanly, and how little that framework applied to what he was doing now. When they arrived at his house on the outskirts of the city, Michael did not hesitate, though he felt the weight of the threshold as Emily stepped inside, carrying nothing but borrowed clothing and the fragile certainty that she could not go back. The house was quiet, orderly, shaped by years of deliberate solitude, and Michael noticed how the silence settled differently with another presence inside it, less hollow, more expectant. Shadow moved through the space with practiced calm, not exploring so much as confirming, establishing safety through familiarity rather than control, and Michael understood that the dog had already accepted this place as part of a new responsibility. Emily sat, shoulders lowering as if her body were slowly learning that it no longer needed to brace for impact, and when she asked what would happen next, her voice held resolve instead of fear. Michael answered carefully, not offering guarantees he could not keep, but outlining what he knew would come. Calls from the hospital, follow-ups from authorities, decisions that would demand patience rather than strength. He told her that the baby would need time, that healing rarely moved in straight lines, and that systems could be slow even when intentions were good. He also told her that she would not face any of it alone, and this time the words did not feel provisional or reactive, but settled, anchored by choice rather than impulse. Emily listened without interrupting, absorbing information the way someone does when they are finally allowed to plan beyond survival, and Michael felt the quiet gravity of that moment settle into him. Later, as night deepened and the city beyond the windows fell fully silent, the phone rang with the call they had been waiting for, the update brief but meaningful, the baby stable enough to rest without constant intervention. Michael watched Emily take in the news, saw the way her breath steadied instead of breaking, and understood that this was what resolution looked like in real life, not triumph or certainty, but the ability to stand without collapsing. Shadow lifted his head briefly at the change in the room, then settled again, content in a way that spoke not of rest, but of purpose fulfilled for the moment. Michael realized then that his own restlessness had eased as well, replaced by something quieter and more demanding, a commitment that did not rely on adrenaline or orders, but on consistency. He thought of the years he had spent believing that distance was the only way to survive what he had seen and done, and how incomplete that belief felt now. Protection, he understood, was not only about standing between danger and the vulnerable, but about staying when the danger receded and the harder work began. As Emily finally slept, exhaustion claiming her without fear this time, Michael remained awake, sitting in the quiet house with Shadow nearby, listening to the steady rhythms of a life no longer defined solely by past losses. He did not know what the future would require of him beyond patience and resolve, but for the first time since leaving the service, the uncertainty did not feel like a void. It felt like responsibility accepted, not imposed. Outside, the snow reflected the faint light of dawn beginning to form, and Michael understood that this was not a return to who he had been, nor an escape from what he carried, but a deliberate step forward. He had not saved everyone, and he would not try to. But he had chosen to stay when staying mattered, and in that choice, he found something he had not known he was missing, not redemption or absolution, but a reason to keep watch without waiting for orders. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive like thunder from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as a choice, a pause, a hand that stays when it could have walked away. Many people wait for God to change the world in one great act, but often He works through ordinary hearts, through moments when compassion wins over fear, and responsibility is chosen over comfort. In daily life, miracles look small, listening instead of turning away, protecting instead of judging, staying present when leaving would be easier. If this story touched something inside you, let it remind you that kindness is never wasted, and that even the darkest winters can carry unseen purpose. Share this story with someone who may need hope today, leave a comment with your thoughts or your own story, and subscribe to the channel so more messages like this can reach those who feel alone. May God bless you, guide you, and protect you and your loved ones, and may peace follow you long after this story ends.